Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is the first time I've ever hosted a space, so I appreciate everyone's patience. So I just posted on the thread the slides to follow along here. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and start. So welcome everyone to Goddess in the Sill, a survey of the third house. And this we're just going to be taking a little bit more of a nuanced dive into this wonderful wonderful place that's deceivingly plain. It's often one of those houses that when one is delineating, they just sort of throw their hands up and just say, "Oh, I guess that's just stuff around you, or it's your siblings," and it's and I think it's just interesting. I believe that it's sort of the feature of this house as opposed to a bug. So just to going on to the second slide just to give a brief overview of what what we're going to be going over. First, just in order to define a house, we just have to kind of go over some foundations here. So we're just going to take a brief look at the astrological houses, and then also we're going to be taking a look at the planetary joys scheme, as is one of my favorite schemes to work with. And then also we're going to look at triplicities and the triplicity lords. And another name that they're often given in the older texts is trigon. So like the trigon lords. So tri pertaining to three. And then once we kind of go through over these foundational things, then we're going to look at specifically the main topic, which is looking at the third house, the place of the goddess Thea, and its significations. And we'll be going, and from there, we'll move on to the triplicity significators from the Persian astrologers. And then moving on from there, we'll go into my personal alternative triplicity scheme, which, as a person with Mercury Sagittarius, I do have to warn that this is still something I am quantifying to this day and building up uh, chart examples for. But so far, especially in my client work, it's been working really well. And then finally, if we can get through all of these things, I have a case study looking at one particular chart. Okay, so the astrological houses. The houses are divisions of the ecliptic, and so there's essentially we're taking the great circles and then we're just dividing them up into little sections, and each each of them, they act as conduits for the planetary powers to move through the lunar sphere and essentially like impart their influence onto like our terrestrial world. And each section is assigned a life topic which is based off of its physical or its temporal qualities. So another way to describe this is diurnal rotation. You know, for example, if we are looking at the ascendant or the first house, this would equate roughly to between 5 and 6 in the morning, and this would be sunrise. And the first house, it's just going over really briefly, it's just generally it's our character. This is the persona in which we use to interface with our world, and this is the point in which the sun, which we can think of as like the spirit or consciousness, moving out from popping up above the horizon. So it's almost like a wedding between body uh, body and spirit. So like this is so you can see that this house derives its qualities from its temporal and its like physical qualities that are connected with it. And there just wanted to read also, this is also made reference in the Orphic Hymns for the Moon, and this one comes from Thomas Taylor's translation. And just this little section, Luna's amber orb makes night's reflected noon here. And and each of these there's just like so much to just ponder from looking at the houses this way too. And this is one of the reasons why I like to just see the houses as sort of this interdependent part, so that they're not specifically tied to like a sign here, or even a planet, but they're more of their own function. Now, then moving on, then we have the planetary joys scheme, and this essentially just shows where a planet rejoices. And from Chris Brennan's wonderful essay going over triplicities, Chris Brennan states that the naming convention for the houses seem to be derived from the planetary joy scheme. And what this also shows, and how this can like present itself when delineating a chart, is that planets who are rejoicing are strengthened within that place, and this also ends up letting them act as if they were in their domicile. And the unassigned houses are linked to the planet that's making a trine to it. So going to this idea that, well, first backtracking, going to this idea that each of these houses derive their names from the planetary joy. Well, if we look at, if we go through them, we have Mercury, who is said to rejoice in the first house, and the first house is called Helm, and in the Greek, and this is me attempting to pronounce the Greek, oike, so it's like helm. And this is where the connection comes from. If we think about Mercury being here in the first, Mercury's one of Mercury's abilities is to traverse between realms here and to sort of navigate skillfully. And the first house is essentially it's like the pilot seat. This is like us moving through our natal promise to the world. Then going on, the third house would be where the moon rejoices, and thus this place is called Goddess or Theia. The fifth house is called the place of good fortune, and this is where Venus rejoices, and this is called Agathos Tuke. And moving on, sixth house with Mars, this place is called bad fortune, and the Greek title would be Kakos Tuke. And if we go to the ninth house, this place is called God, the place of God, and the Greek title is Theos. And finally, with the last two, we have Jupiter, who rejoices in the 11th. This place is called the house of good spirit, Agathos Daimon. And then Saturn, 12th house, this place is called the place of bad spirit, Kakos Daimon. And I wanted to point out one thing, which is that when we say fortune and spirit, we're talking about fortune being things that are physical, that are manifest here. Just so you can almost relate fortune with the moon, whereas spirit would be the more internal, the subtle here. So we have the places where the nocturnal planets rejoice being connected by fortune, and then we have the diurnal planets being connected by spirit. And one little tangent, one thing that I loved what Austin Coppock has said is that if you think about the nocturnal planets, they all have substance. Like you could actually walk on Venus. You could also actually walk on Mars, although they're assuming that you wouldn't just immediately perish. And if we think about the diurnal planets, then you can't really walk on them. You're sort of just in them, with Jupiter and Saturn, even the Sun just sort of being just Jupiter and Saturn being gas giants, and then the Sun just being a giant molten rock. So, so we have these two. So bringing up these two things, we have these houses which are connected, which are given sort of topics of our lived experience. Then we go further and start to see that there is a scheme attached to certain houses that give them meaning. Um, oh, and then the last part, which is we have some houses that are unassigned. So that would be that would be the second house, the gate of Hades. We would have, and then the fourth. This is the subterraneous. Although a lot of ancient authors will call this place the subterraneous pivot, because it is an angular place. And the seventh, setting, and the eighth, idol, and then finally the midhaven. Well, now what's really interesting, and this could be a whole entire conversation topic on itself, is that if we can actually see, we can see which specific planet makes a trine with these empty houses. So from Saturn, casts Saturn, the 12th house, bad spirit, would cast a trine onto the fourth and the eighth here. So then we know. So then we can relate that the fourth and the eighth having connections with Saturn, and then with the second and the 10th, these both create a trine with Mars. So then we can see that we can associate these two houses having a connection with Mars as well. And then just for being thorough, the Greek title for Gate of Hades is Aldo Pule, and and then for the fourth house subterranean, it'd be Upagaesion, and then eighth house, the idol place, Argos, and then the midhaven, Mesumaranima, probably butchering that. Going on to the next part, we're onto the slides about the triplicity lords, the trigons. Now, this is one of my favorite dignities, which is on the slide. I have it in quotations, a minor dignity. It's because I think all of the parts of the essential dignity are just very important. So, what are the triplicities? The triplicities show environmental and communal support, and the triplicities, and each triplicity is assigned three planets, and we can think, and the triplicity would be organized around the elements. So the fire triplicity would be Aries, Leo, Sagittarius. The air triplicity would be Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. Then following that, the water triplicity would be Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces. Then finally, Earth, Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. And triplicities, when we're looking at it in terms of judging a planet's condition, we would see triplicity as being representative of environmental and communal support. So and this can make a world of difference for planets, because it's one thing to be sort of like to be lacking in resources, or be given the wrong tools for the resource for the thing that is required, but then to be supported by the environment around, that makes a big difference. Another interesting point that I just want to throw in here, and this is what I learned, is that triplicities precede the elements. So the triplicities were originally oriented around the cardinal winds from Egypt. Now, my favorite part about the triplicities is the planetary assignments here, and again, off of Chris Brennan's just wonderful paper about triplicities and planetary joys. That's what it is, the planetary joys paper. Him and Robert Schmidt have found that the assignment of the triplicities to be based off of the planetary joy scheme, and particularly when you're looking at it through the angular triad. And what I mean by that is just looking at how the two houses that flank the angles here, and the Persian astrologers have used the trigons to specify house significations, and this is one of my favorite uses of the triplicity lords. And to just go over really quickly, with each triplicity is assigned 3 planets, and these planets will shift based off of sect. So for example, if we're talking about the fire trigon, then the 3 planets assigned to it would be the sun, Jupiter, and then the third participating would be Saturn. And the primary trip lord would be given to the sun, and then the secondary would be given to Jupiter, then the third would be to Saturn. And if you have a night chart, then this order is then you flip the first 2. So then Jupiter would be the primary trip lord, then the sun, then following Saturn. So I wanted to go over these foundations because we're going to be using these things to really just start to tease out and like fully define the third house here. So now finally let's move on to the third house and its significations. Thea. So if we're looking at just very before we go through this little list, I just wanted to read this wonderful quote from Manilius from the Astronomica, Book 2. That part of heaven which rises first from the bottommost regions and brings back the sky once more controls the fortunes and fates of brothers, and it acknowledges the moon as its mistress, who beholds her brother's realm shining on her from the other side of heaven and reflects human mortality in the dying edges of her face. Goddess is the name to be given to this region. So we can see that even from one of the earliest astrological texts, we see a connection between the planet and then the house here. So let's go over just sort of like what is physically happening with the third house. One, the third house is cadent, so it's falling or declining from the angle, and planets that are in the cadent houses have a little less strength. They're a little tied up. And again, I just love how Austin has described cadent houses, is that they tend to be houses that have a lot of things going on, whether that is like activities or problems, and they need to be attended to or they need to be solved, so that by the time the planet is done doing all of those things, then it doesn't have a lot left to give. The third house is also under the horizon, so naturally this is going to be this house is going to be related with the night, and this is where the moon rejoices. So the third house, just as Manilius describes it, the third house is the house of the moon, and this is the first idea that got me really thinking about the third house here. Because the moon has so many significations. The moon is so changeable, and from a magical perspective, would it be magical? I guess maybe more hermetic, that all of the rays of the planets are funneled through the moon, which then the moon transposes onto our terrestrial world. And temporally, the sun transits here around 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. So we already have midnight being the fourth house. So if we go right next to it, then about 1 a.m. 2 a.m. This is still and this again bringing back the part of the Orphic hymn where the moon makes nights. The reflection of the moon makes nights reflected noon here. Now, in terms of aspects, this house is going to be considered to be supportive because it's receiving the ascendant by sextile, and then it also it casts a trine onto the 7th, and it receives a trine from the 11th. So
So just from looking at these things, we can tell that because it's receives it receives the ascendant, meaning the ascendant is the one who would cast the ray of a sextile onto it. Often this this can really speak to how oftentimes the person gets to sort of decide what what environment the third house might be. Um, and if we look at this the trine that the third makes with the seventh and the 11th, then we can also see that one, there is the third house also is all about other people, and not only about other people, it's also about those who are out. It's also about those who are like allied with us and those who we would share in a common dream, hope, and perhaps even like those that we place trust in. So just looking just purely off of the location of the third house, we can get some ideas of like what is actually going on, and we know that oftentimes we can just look at this and think, okay, so the third house has got to do with people, and oftentimes the people here make are are supportive and complementary to the person. And then now continuing on, if we start to go through the specific significations of the third house, and this list, which is organized chronologically, was compiled by Demetra George off of her wonderful volume 2 of Ancient Astrology. Highly recommend grabbing the first and second volume if you're just really digging traditional astrology. So to just go over these. I'm just going to go over a list of significations that were given during before medieval times. So starting from the earliest signification that was given comes from Hermes, which was actually it allegedly came from Hermes, but was given by Thrasyllus, which is praxis. So what one does. So that's really interesting right away that we get the third house as what one does here. Then Thrasyllus also says siblings. Now we move on to Antiochus. Antiochus says friends pop up here. And then we go to Manilius, and Manilius says fate and the fate and fortune of siblings here. Now this is really interesting. It's not just the siblings, but it's also like what befalls them. Um, and and then going on to Valens, those close to the heart, relatives, authority, and the place of the queen here. And this makes sense too, because this is a house where one of the luminaries reside. And the luminaries we can kind of see as, at least I view them as sort of sovereign to life, to to our existence here. Firmicus says this place is about travel, authority with the metacosmic, dreams and religious observance. And then, Firmicus says travel, and then Rhetorius says authority with the metacosmic, dreams, religious observance, offerings, and currency. And the currency, this seems to be derived from one of the moon's significations of being tied with the market. Because I mean, if you think about back then, you had silver as a unit of currency here, and silver was much easier to produce and get a hold of as opposed to gold. And go and this is these ideas I learned reading Ace's wonderful book, Post-Colonial Astrology. Absolutely wonderful book. And then this silver was also since it was more accessible. This is often what sort of those in the lower classes would use, and we can again, and you can trace this connection to even the mundane astrology. And in mundane astrology, the third house is often assigned the signification of like the common folk, people. So we see with the significations kind of lining up with what with the kind of like the physical properties of what's going on with the third house. So again, we're seeing this idea of, okay, there's people here, people who are close by, but then also there's this huge connection with spirituality, dreams, real, um, it, to kind of just the way I was just like thinking of it is that the third house is a very witchy house here. Um, some of the ancient authors have also talked about there's this mysterious quality to the third house. And if we look at if we look at the third and the ninth house, if we look at the ninth house is about the sun, and one of the most plain things about the sun is that things are seen, things are very visible, whereas the moon is only visible at certain points, and it's slow, and the moon is, and when the moon has finished waxing, and then pretty soon it goes back into invisibility. So there is this idea of like secretness to the third house here, and if we relate this with like religion and spirituality, then we could think of the third house being more of like sort of how one personally um, observes religious or spiritual traditions. And another way to think about this is if we think about going to church, for example, the going to the congregation would be the ninth house part, but then coming back home and doing the prayers and offerings personally, that would be the third house experience. So back to this idea, and going back to what Hermes/Thrasyllus says, praxis, what one does. And to go over some of the modern significators, we have Alan Leo saying that minor impressions, learning, and education. And Dane Rudyard says the relationship of the child to their environment and the development of intelligence. And Carol Ryder writes regular routines, short trips locally, so errands, for example, the usual companions, neighbor, and communications. Now, often one of the things that's given to the third house is communication, which the third house is very much about communication. But what I find is that what's helpful is to sort of paying more attention to the process of like communicating or writing. For example, the moon's job is to be a vessel. Since the moon holds the light of the sun, this is how we are able to see, night's reflected noon. So what is like so language and writing is essentially is giving a form to ideas and thoughts. So in a sense, like writing is incredibly lunar, and one of my favorite lunar offerings is journaling. Is just giving something form. Now, going on to the next slide, and I have just a few more quotes because there's just some really beautiful quotes here. So I'll just read this really fast, and this is from the Tetrabiblos by Ptolemy. The moon, as the heavenly body, nearest the earth, bestows her effluence most abundantly upon mundane things. For most of them, animate or inanimate, are sympathetic to her and change in company with her. The rivers increase and diminish their streams with her light. The seas tum their own tides with her rising and settings, and plants and animals in whole or in some part wax and wane with her. And I really like this quote. I really like this quote because when I think about, we start to add all of these qualities. It's like, okay, the third house is where the moon rejoices. So the third house is kind of like is sort of like the moon, and the moon is responsible for the like physical things that have form and substance. And then we also relate it with like the seventh house and the 11th house, and we're bringing people in. So it seems like the third house really, the way I see the third house is sort of this little our own magical bubble here. if we go back to this and going to the moon's job is to manifest things. So the third house is sort of like our personal little sphere of like manifestation, and manifesting things is an incredibly uh, is a difficult process, and this is like what a lot of magic is literally just about. Okay, how do you do it without bringing the things you want to bring, and keeping away the things you don't want to bring. So it's like the third house is like our own little sphere where it seems it's our own little sphere and little environment where this is what we experience, and often it's in our neighborhoods. It's in it's in our neighborhoods. It's our commute. It's when we go to the grocery store, and a lot of these things are sort of things that one will easily go into sort of autopilot mode when they're kind of doing these things. It's like if you've done a commute hundreds and hundreds of times, then it becomes muscle memory to the point where you can just kind of go through the motions and not even completely be aware of what's happening. And I think this is one, and this kind of goes back to, if we think about the third house being connected with dreams, because when we enter a dream state, this is when the grip of the conscious mind begins to wane. And if going with magic, when we sort of get out of our conscious mind's way, then that's sort of when we can work with and let power move through. So I'm going to go back around and all around to those ideas, but I wanted to go over now with if we look at the third house with the lens of derivative houses. This is where it gets really interesting, and I highly recommend you to do this little meditation with all of the houses, as it really can expand your understanding of a house. So right off the bat, if we look at derivative houses, so if we were to place the third house into the first, then we would see that the 12th house is 10th from third here. And on the slide, it says 12th is 10th from Thea. And I put Thea instead of third house so that it would just read a little bit more clear. But Thea as in the third house. So the 12th house is the 10th from the third. And, the 12th house, what I find it to be about a lot. We can think of the 12th house as being two things. One, it's a difficult house because it's in an aversion to the first. So there's this, in the way that ancient astrologers have described aspects is that it's sort of when planets are looking upon each other. So the 12th house is a difficult place because it is hard to see it. There is a invisibility going on with it. And then the 12th house also is really a house of like solitude and isolation here. So if we think about the 12th being 10th from the third, then the 10th house would be overcoming. The 10th position would be the one that overcomes the first. So in other words, the 12th house would be overcoming the third. So we have this idea of, then we can add these qualities to the third house experience, which is that the third house experience is sort of alone. It can feel like a lonely one, but it's also a little hard to see for other people, because again, like the 10th house would be the 10th from the third would be like the most visible, the culminating point. And what is most visible is that it is sort of invisible here, and it's sort of secret. And and a good friend of mine, Jessica, brought up a really good example. But if we can think about sororities and fraternities, they're often, they're sisterhoods and brotherhoods that are veiled in secrecy here. If we go, so kind of moving on, if we look at the sixth house would be fourth from the third, and this would be sort of like I always like to think of the fourth as the foundation, and I think this is really beautiful here, the sixth house being the foundation of the third. And what is the sixth house is just physical things that need to be dealt with that are physical. these are physical problems. So the sixth house being forced from Thea really speaks to the what often is the backdrop of the third house is like dealing with physical things that need to be dealt with. For example, running errands. So going to your grocery store, or or like the physical requirement of caffeine. So going to your local coffee shop. It's like there's this. It seems there's a very oftentimes the third house things happen under with this like with the necessity of dealing with everyday responsibilities. What I think is really beautiful, kind of moving on, is that the fifth house then would be the third from the third here. So we think about and this kind of goes back to this idea of like manifestation being really tied in with the third, because the fifth house, the primary signification of the fifth house would be, your child, and that could be literally a child, or that could be a brainchild, a creative project that's being brought forth. So the fifth house is like would be like our personal creative resources, or our what we can generate through our libidinal energy. And this place is supportive of the third. So it really speaks to this idea that we're kind of putting in things in our third house here. And then finally, the 11th house then is ninth from the third. And I think about the ninth house, the ninth place from the third. This would sort of be like this would be the point of the thing that one tries to like move towards here. And the 11th house, being a Jupiter house, is the thing that is aspiring is like this communal is this is the realization of communal dreams and hopes here. So so we kind of look at these derivative houses. We can tell, like, again, emphasizing this idea that there's something secretive about the third house, and oftentimes we experience it under the necessity of just being manifest, and what is supportive of the third house experience is often from our own creative resource pool, and that the thing that the third house ends up the philosophical outlook that the third is moving towards is a communal connection. Okay, so moving on to moving on to the triplicity assignment here. I essentially a lot of these authors are repeating the same ideas that were brought up here. So this is from the Intro to Traditional Astrology by Abu Mashar and Al-Qabisi. The third house of brothers and sisters, also kinsmen, in those who are esteemed, faith and religion, commands and legates change and short journeys, and it signifies the condition of life before death. Al-Andar Zagar said, the first lord of the triplicity of the house of brothers signifies older brothers, and the second one, the middle ones, but the third one, the younger ones, and their worthiness according to their places. And I always found this really interesting too, because like we just went through this huge list of significators here, and even within the same block, we have these ideas of like short journeys, like religion here, kinsmen, faith, all of these things being brought up. Yet then when we go to the triplicity associations, it's just the siblings here. This part is this is the part was really interesting to me, and it makes me think about how, again, there's something secretive about the third house, especially it being sort of like lunar here. It's lunar here. There's a little bit of there's these ties of like witchcraft, animism, and magic into it. And if we're thinking about back then, these were often things that needed to be guarded with secrecy because these things were considered to be powerful. And a lot of the Persian, one of my favorite parts about medieval astrology is this use of triplicity assignments, which is using these trip lords to get further clarify the topics of a house. And I have a quote down below, and this is from Guido Bonatti from Liber Astronomiae, Part 2. And Bonatti also contributes to this triplicity list, but Bonatti writes, "The moon rejoices in the third because the third signifies short and quick journeys, and things which change quickly, and which repeat. Whence the moon signifies speedy and quick changes from one purpose to another, from one thing to another." So we have this from Bonatti, yet if we go to the Trip Lords, again, Bonatti just basically writes the same exact thing. First Trip Lord is the oldest brother, second Trip Lord is the middling brother or sibling, the third one is the youngest sibling. So maybe it's just like my Merc Sag. One thing I love about tapping into the lineage of astrology is that we're letting this like painstaking work that's been gathered over centuries like bolster ability our ability to delineate the stars, to translate the language of the planets here. But at the same time, though, it's just like, I don't know about this. This seems like there's just so much going on here to just have these trip lords be just related with the brothers. So moving on to the next slide, this is my personal hot take that I am attempting to build examples and verify it. But I propose another triplicity assignment here, and this is based off of what I could discern the rationale behind how the trip lords were associated. So just like to go over really briefly, if we think about if we go to the let's do the sixth house. The trip associations, the trigon associations of the sixth house would be the first trigon of the sixth is given to physical harm. The second trigon is given to servitude and labor, particularly menial labor, and the third trigon is given to pets. It's given to pets here. So if we look at this, it seems like the first two significators seem to be sort of like what the house is about. Whereas, like, I feel you could definitely say, oh yes, sixth house is about physical harm, and oh yes, sixth house is about menial labor. Whereas the third last one seems to be the auxiliary, things that are related with that house, but then they don't like stand on their own as a way to just like define that house, So to say the sixth house is pets wouldn't be wrong, but it would also just not be entirely correct. So, so it seems like the first trip lord is assigned the most literal and physical thing about that house, whereas the second one is like again, a very important significator, but it tends to be a little bit more subtle, a little more internal. Then the third trip lord seems to be given to things that are auxiliary, that are part of but don't exist on their own. So going with this, I propose an alternative triplicity assignment to the third, which is the first trip lord would then, of course, associate with siblings the oldest, but it is also intimate friendships. As Valens says, those who are dear to the heart. It is also familiar commutes, and the environment that is nearby. So again, like this is a lunar house, so there's something very physical about this house here, and it's close, and it's close to us, and it's also supportive. So this is just like literally the neighborhood that we're in, the friends that we can call at 3 a.m. to go cry on their shoulders here. These are the places that we can let our guard down. I've assigned the second trip lord to the middle sibling, but also it's habitual or routine praxis. So what are the things that we just often do? Here is also where casual communication or the local language would be. So if we think about, so the third house is very, there's a very idiosyncratic feeling with the third house. It's very personal here. So when I say like casual communication, this is like inside jokes, but shared between close friends. And going back to this idea of that, like from an outsider's perspective, they're sort of separated from it. It's like when the feeling of when you're with a group of people and they all just start cracking an inside joke and they're all laughing with each other, and it's like, oh, you're not a part of this. So this is like a very third house thing, and kind of going back with 12th house being the 10th from third. And also this, I loved how Austin put this, which is the daily the daily program. So like what the things that often take place regularly and repeatedly, and this idea of repeated is important because this is I'm talking about the moon here, and the moon is the quickest of the planets here. So and the moon is cyclical. So there's this idea of repetition here. That's usually happening. So then I didn't put it on this list, but I would also relate the second trip lord was sort of like what is like the educational experience, or what is the quality of that? And then also throwing it in here is the social media feed, like, or the stuff that gets blogged. This is like all part of the idea of praxis, what one does. And then finally, with a participating with a participating lord, I would assign this to the youngest sibling, of course. Sacred observances, the application of religion and divination, dreams and sleep, and then maybe also like the experience of like markets and merchants might pop up here as well. Um, so these are like, again, these are all things that have to do with the third house, but it would it wouldn't be entirely correct for me to say, oh, your third house is dreams and sleep, and or oh, your third house is the application of religion, blah blah blah. It's like yeah, that's true, but like that doesn't sound quite right. Um, and to me, for me this was important because if the third house is about what is close to us, and also the types of people that we hold dear to us and close, then that to me, and it's a house about the moon, then to me this is a very intimate house. This is an incredibly intimate house here. Um, and two, it would be the difference of asking somebody, how are you? And it would be the difference of getting a response of, I'm good, versus, oh, let me tell you about my day. It's, to me, if if we can really delineate the condition of someone's third house, then we get an incredibly rich and intimate snapshot of their day to day. Here, and this is, from my experience, this is what the third house is about. The third house is like, what do they experience on a daily basis here? What do they experience on a daily basis? What are they like when they let their guard down? You know, how do they talk? How do they speak when they feel comfortable? And then how do they personally devote themselves to that which is sacred? You know, so these are just like, there's so much going on there, and it's like, and yes, it's like, yes, the third house is about communication, yes, the third house is about your siblings, but it's like, if we kind of break these down a little bit further, it's like, well, what is going on? It's like, what this I like, what's going on with the siblings, what's going on with like their communication. No. So this is like, I just really, this is why the third house is just one of my favorite places to explore, because it's just so, it it is so deceivingly plain, and that is by function. That is a feature of it. It it's a place where we can let our guards down. This is the neighborhood that we walk through. These are the people that we say hi to and banter with when we're picking up a coffee, or when we're going to the gym here. Um, these are these are all of our experience, uh, our experiences of like unverified gnosis. Although I don't really like that word that much, but it's like these are all of these things are happening. Where the third house is where the conscious mind wanes, so that the magic of the moon can come forth. And that's why the third house is like our personal little sphere that we of what we can manifest often it is placed at that in the third. So just running short on time. So just wanted to go get to this part. So the case study, I have a few charts that I've been looking at, but the one that's most interesting is Matahari. And Matahari was originally a dancer turned into an espionage agent. Ba- ba- back right before she was born, right or sorry, word salad. Matahari was born and like living her life around the time of like World War One. So if we just like look, so if we bring up these ideas of just like this this a little bit more in depth way of looking at the third house, we see okay, so and this I've got Placidus on display in this slide, but I do the chaos Merc Sag thing and I look at two systems. So I look at both Placidus and the whole sign. So if we're looking at Matahari's chart, the the third sign, the third whole sign would be Capricorn. So then we know that Saturn Pisces is the lord of the third. So we know that there's a tie, and since it's Pisces, Pisces is the fifth whole sign from Scorpio. So we know that there is a tie with the fifth house playing into here. So fifth, uh, the the significations of Mata's everyday experiences um, often serve the agenda of the fifth house, which is this is about children. Then this is about pleasures and vices. Um, well, just really, like kind of going over really briefly. Matahari was considered to be one of the most beautiful dancers, and um, was considered to be one of the most beautiful dancers, and was very very out there for during a very modest time. A lot of criticisms thrown at her were about how she was just ba- basically an adulteress, basically a like sex worker, even though she never actually outright did any of these things. So now if we're looking at the three trip lords here to just give a little further look at what is going on with the third house. We have Venus. Um, we've got Venus, Moon, and Mars being the trip lords of the third. So, with and remember normally the in a night chart this would be reversed, where the moon would be the primary and Venus would be the secondary. But we have a day chart, so we have Venus the primary, the moon the secondary, and Mars the participating. So if we look at Venus, Venus is in the ninth, and we're looking at, and this is like, again, we're going to this idea of what is happening in the neighborhood, who are the close friends, and what's going on with the siblings. And it's Venus in the ninth here. So we've got, so Matahari had a very nice and lavish life until had a very nice lavish life, and then would often dream about living in a castle, um, and she ended up having to move into a different school because of her father's business like falling off and him lapsing into a bout of alcoholism. But so she had to go somewhere far away. So she ends up somewhere far away, and then
after and this trend just keeps continuing. Like after being moved to this school, I believe it was in Switzerland, she ends up she ends up moving again with a to be with her betrothed, and she ends up moving to Indonesia. So there's this connection of that her local environment tends to be places that are far away. Um, and and we look at the moon now being related with the habitual or the habitual or routine praxis, the casual communication, or the local language. Now, what's interesting here is that the moon is the lord of Venus in the ninth here. So this is exactly what happened. I mean, Mata Hari was a dancer, and the moon is very physical. So and it would be in her fifth house. So part of um, her creative expression, if you will, or just part of her creative resource is using her body here, is using her body, and she was a dancer, and not only that though, but she had really soaked in the um, the the community and the language in Indonesia, and this is where she got she got her name from here, and she was able to pick up the language, and a lot of her dance performances were informed by had a South Asian sensibility here. So it's like so she was bringing all of these things in, and this was a part of her praxis. She was able to transpose the local language into form through her body. Um, and then finally, Mars is sacred observances, the application of religion, divine dreams and sleep. And and Mars here is, even though Mars is angular, there's a there's a little bit of there's a lot of contention happening here, because especially with Mars being her malefic out of sect, and as she as she pushes herself out into the world, and she's getting all of this attraction. She oh, sorry, let me back up. Like, not only is Mars the malefic out of sect, Mars is also would be her, because she's got a Scorpio rising chart. So when we look at Mars in the tenth, it's like the tenth house. If we to just really say it briefly, would be, oh, what one does, and we have Mars here. So she what she's known for is like to literally just like her ability to capture attention here, with Mars being in the sun's sign. But it's the malefic out of sect too. So even though this was something that was this was her sort of like religious observance, which was like moving it through her body. It was sort of taken in all sorts of different ways. Like, it was criticized by some, and others, it was it dazzled them, it tantalized them. Now, what's really interesting is that we also have Mars that is under combustion with the sun, and this brings this idea of like invisibility here. And Mata Hari was a spy. She was actually she actually played like double agent a lot. So she um, her clientele were often high-ranking military officers, lawyers, and government officials. And because she had already gone, she had already moved around a lot. She already had a passport, and she had this ability to move between countries, and this made her really appealing to be used as a spy here. Um, so this is again, it's like we're going this go. Sorry. And then one last point, and I know we're running out of time. There's one thing that is quoted that oftentimes people had felt that Mata was able to sort of capture their dreams and their fantasies. I mean, really, they're just honestly just projecting onto her. But it's like we have that
last Trip Lord being her, literally in the 10th house in this public space. Now, her chart is interesting because everything is so like intermingled together, and again, this alternative triplicity assignment is something that I'm still to this day like building up case studies and like checking, looking it over. So I don't take it as gospel, but it is something. It is a very, at least for me, it's been a very useful tool to just sort of get more mileage out of the third house when like using it, when delineating it, and just being able to provide more perspective and insight for whoever calls upon, who requests and calls upon your abilities and talents. Okay, so I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. This is my first talk ever. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing your just like if you want to like play with these alternate triplicity assignments. I'm just really looking forward to hearing what you might find from it. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the evening, and I hope you continue enjoying all of these wonderful talks going on from other astrologers. And I will see you all on the internet.